So like Nadia said, my name is Eva. I am based in Chicago. I work at a software consultancy called A-Flight. And this is about designing against domestic violence. And I use the term designing because I'm a designer, but really this is for anyone who makes any type of digital product is going to get a lot from this. So a quick note before we begin. Like I said, this talk does cover domestic violence. It's going to cover that very explicitly. I'm going to be telling stories and sharing statistics. So if at any time you're feeling just overwhelmed or like you need to leave the room, please do so. I'm not going to be upset, and no one's going to judge you for that. So I want to start with a quick story. And this is the first of a few stories that I'll be sharing. So this is Isaac and Helen. And after they got married, they merged their finances together, and they opened up a joint bank account. Now, despite the fact that they went to the bank together to open up their joint bank account, joint accounts typically are actually just accounts that are meant for one person, and then they kind of tack on a second person. And there's a primary user who has more privileges. And they made Isaac that primary person. So this means that whenever Helen logs in from a new computer or there's something else that triggers some type of security issue, she gets these identity verification questions, and they're all about Isaac's identity. So she has to ask him, like, hey, which street did you live on in college, and different things like that. And of course, this gives Isaac a lot more power over their finances because he can just say, I'm not going to answer this question, and now she doesn't have access to their money. And that's exactly what he does. He cuts off access to their funds over time and basically just gives her money when he thinks that she really needs it. Without true access to their money, Helen is really dependent on him for a lot of different things. It also makes it really, really hard to leave him, even though she really wants to, because she doesn't have access to any of their funds. So 1 in 5 women in Canada who are experiencing physical abuse are also experiencing some type of financial abuse, like what I just described. But in all likelihood, this number is actually a lot higher. There are some studies in America that show that people going through domestic violence are at a risk of 98% to experience financial violence, which is almost all of them. A lot of these statistics are really hard to come by because a lot of them rely on self-reporting, which is definitely going to mean that the numbers are a lot lower than what they actually are because this is a very hidden issue and a lot of women don't talk about it. So when we talk about designing against financial abuse, this is the first way that I'm going to start to kind of break down this problem of designing against domestic violence into some more manageable chunks. There are a few things that we can think about. The first is making joint bank accounts actually joint in a digital sense and not just having something that's meant for one person, kind of tacking on a secondary user who has a lot less privileges. And this is especially important because we live in a patriarchal society that is going to default power to the man over the woman in most cases. It's also something that we could be doing, programming this financial software to recognize these signs of abuse. This is something that is already being done in so many different ways. There's so much advanced sort of pattern recognition that is possible right now, and this could be done within financial software to recognize when this is happening, because this would then allow people who are working in finance actually interfacing with customers to provide a meaningful source of intervention. This is a much bigger lift than the rest of my suggestions that I'm going to have, or a little more manageable in day-to-day, but I want to put this out here because it is my hope that someone here who's working in financial tech or in one of my talks someday will decide to take this on, because this could be a really important intervention place. When I was doing this research, I found that this actually does exist in most countries in terms of elderly abuse. People who work in banks are trained on how to recognize abuse of the elderly, like a parent taking advantage of the finances of someone who's really old and unable to do it themselves, and it's very effective. So there's already a model here that works, and it could be used for the same sort of thing in terms of domestic relationships. Also, when I was doing research, I found that lots of bankers had this experience where they've had an instance where they're working with a couple and there's some red flags, there's definitely some creepy behavior, financially controlling stuff going on, but they're not trained on it and they're definitely not empowered to do anything. So they just kind of have to make a judgment call and hope that it works out. So quickly, today's goals. I'm not going to be doing just general domestic violence education. This is really about how we as designers and technology makers can be a part of the solution on ending domestic violence. And I'm assuming, there's 2 tracks. You could have gone to something else. I'm assuming that because you're here, you believe that this is a real issue and that it's worth solving, and this is a space where the reality of domestic violence is validated. So I want to do a quick note about language. There are both male and female survivors of domestic violence, and there are people who don't identify as male or female who experience this as well. And it's really important to acknowledge the male victims because they face even more shame and stigma around coming forward about domestic abuse. However, when it comes to the breakdown of perpetrators and victims, the overwhelming percent of perpetrators are male, anywhere from 80 to 95%, depending on who's doing the reporting. So there's a very clear breakdown here in terms of gender and who is really being impacted and who's kind of doing the violence. So I'm not going to be using gender-neutral language or gender-neutral stories because this is not a gender-neutral problem. This is a problem mainly of male violence. So if you're a man in the room and you start to feel uncomfortable or defensive, I really urge you to just kind of sit with those feelings, try to be open to the presentation, and remember that you're being invited to be a part of the solution. Erica Hall at Mule Design says, "The most important topic in design is how the systems we create are mediating interactions among humans." And this applies to so many different things, but it's really at the heart of what this presentation is about. How can we encourage interactions that are honest and positive and safe, and discourage ones that are dishonest or hateful or violent? There aren't any silver bullets. Every product is really different, which means that with every product, there's different ways that someone could potentially use it to abuse someone else. And there's a lot of things that we're kind of thinking about in terms of this, things that we need to be keeping in mind outside of just domestic violence. And I know that I'm really interested in these things, but trying to do all of this has started for me to feel really overwhelming. Like, when am I just designing my UI? I'm trying to keep all of these different things in mind. To kind of answer this, I created a very simple framework that brings together some of the different things that I think are important to think about, as well as thinking about domestic violence. The other thing that I think is very important is to have the right mindset going into this. So that's kind of what this talk is going to get at. It's going to help you get into the right mindset for how to do this through some more stories and statistics to kind of give you an understanding of how technology has a role to play in domestic violence. I want to quickly mention this concept of impact over intent, because designers and developers and anyone who makes technology, they're never setting out, with very few exceptions of people who are legitimately evil, they're never setting out to make something that's going to harm someone else, right? But when it does happen, like when an Uber self-driving car does kill someone in America, the reaction is to say, oh, we didn't mean for that to happen. That wasn't our intent. Of course we didn't mean for this. But it doesn't really matter to the family of the woman that was killed. What matters is the impact. So this is a very important thing to keep in mind. It's great if you have a good intent, but ultimately impact is what matters more. So I'm going to just go through a few quick definitions and numbers before we get to more stories. First, domestic violence is the physical, sexual, emotional, psychological, or financial abuse at the hands of a domestic relation. So this technically covers not just intimate partners, but roommates or other family members who are living with you. And I want to point out that when we think of this, we usually think of the physical side of it, but it doesn't have to be physical to count with this definition. It can be just emotional, it can be just financial. And I say just, but really those things are a really big deal, and they do count as domestic violence. I also want to point out that this occurs in all different groups, pretty much across the board. People with more resources have a lot higher ability to hide it, go to sort of fancy private hospitals and keep things very hidden, not have to go to work with bruises, etc. But it definitely does occur in all income ranges, all races, all ages. It occurs in queer relationships, straight relationships, and it's very hidden, but it's definitely there. This is a statistic about in America where there's more people, and I just wanted to share it because the rest of the things I'll be using are, I've found statistics strictly for Canada, but this is important if you have any users in the US. It's over 4 million women every year who experience domestic violence. In Canada, there's this statistic that 1 in 5 women will experience domestic abuse at some point in her life. And for men, that number is 1 in 6. So this is very common for both men and women. It's not an edge case. It's not something that can be ignored or pushed away. And for anyone who saw Errol's talk, I really liked how they were saying, we need to question this whole concept of edge cases in general. They're often used by people with power to kind of push people with less power to the margins and not worry about them or not think about them. And I definitely agree with that we need to be questioning that. And we also need to be questioning, is this actually an edge case in general? Because a lot of times we don't actually have numbers around these things, but when you look a little closer, it's not an edge case at all. All right, so I'm going to move into our second story. Lisa is an editor working in San Francisco, and Ben is her husband. He's a software developer in tech, and he's really, really, really into smart home devices. So he's got an Alexa that's kind of like his hub for all of the smart home devices. He's got smart locks, smart lights. He's got a Nest to control the temperature. He's really into all of that, and he can control it all very conveniently through an app. Now, he's always been abusive, but he goes on business trips, and it's kind of a time when Lisa gets a little bit of a break from his abuse. But not anymore, because now he's got all of these smart home devices that he can control remotely from an app to harass her and monitor her. So he's away on one of his trips, and Lisa is alone in the house. And suddenly the lights go off. And she turns them back on with her app, and then they go off again. And she's getting really spooked out and creeped out. So she decides to just leave the house and go for a walk. And when she comes back, she puts her code into the smart lock, and it doesn't work. She tries it again, and it still doesn't work. So she texts Ben and says, my code isn't working, and he texts her a new code, and he says, this has always been the code. And she's like, I don't think so. And he's like, no, it definitely has. What's wrong with you? This has always been the code. Why can't you just remember? The next day, Lisa's making lunch in the kitchen, and she suddenly realizes that she's really hot. And I apologize, I didn't change this to centigrade. This is not actually that hot in Fahrenheit, but she's sweating, it's summertime, and she goes over to the Nest and sees that it's set to a very hot temperature, 40 degrees centigrade maybe. So I think that's hot. So she calls Ben, and she's like, the Nest is being really weird. Did you, accidentally turn it up, maybe? And he's like, oh my God, of course I didn't. Why would I ever do that? You need to relax. You need to just learn how to use these things. It's not that hard. Later on, the doorbell starts ringing, and she's looking at the app, trying to see who it is through the camera, and doesn't see anyone. It's ringing over and over and over again. Now, obviously at this point, Lisa is suspecting that Ben is actually behind all of this. But she decides that she's not going to ask him about it because he's just going to berate her, and it's not going to actually solve anything anyway. So she tries to just continue on with her work with this annoying doorbell ringing all the time. Later on that night, Lisa talks to her sister over the phone, and she's telling her about all the weird things that have been happening, and she wonders out loud if Ben is behind it. She says that it feels like he's trying to make her hate being in her own home. And it's working. Later that night, Ben calls her, and he says, so did you happen to talk to your sister today? And she's like, how did you know that? How did you know? And he's like, of course I didn't know that. I was just asking, why are you so paranoid? But of course Ben did know. He knew that she had been talking to her sister through the Alexa. For anyone who's familiar with an Alexa, it has this feature called drop-in, where you can do a call. And this is really convenient for the sort of use case of a couple where there's no abuse going on. And let's say I'm at home and my cell phone has died. My husband can still call me through the Alexa drop-in. Super convenient. But there's some really big flaws with it. And the main one is that it doesn't have any element of consent. So when you get a call on your cell phone, you see the number and the name if you have it in your phone, and you can say, like, accept this call or decline it. It's giving you that consent. But the drop-in feature doesn't have that. It gives you an alert. Alexa tells you you have an incoming call, and then it just starts. So if you miss that notification from Alexa telling you that this is about to happen, it can basically be used as a listening device because you wouldn't know that it's going on, the other person's not saying anything. And it also doesn't give you consent. Maybe you don't want to talk to that person in that moment, but you don't really have a choice. So he was listening to her through the drop-in feature. And of course, he was behind all of the other things that were going on as well. He was doing something called gaslighting, which is a really common abusive tactic where you basically are kind of making the victim feel like they can't trust their own experiences, that they don't really know what's real, and that they have to rely on the abuser to know what's real and what's not, and to use an ableist term, make them feel like they're going crazy. So this is all very new because smart home devices are new. There aren't really any hard statistics on this anywhere yet, but we do know it's a problem from the people who work in support services for domestic violence survivors. And there was a poll at one of their gatherings, and they said 89% of them said, yes, I've had to deal with some type of misuse of this type of technology with a client in the last year. And we don't know exactly how much of it is smart devices, but anecdotally, this has definitely been a thing that people who work with domestic violence survivors are asking about. How do I handle this? How do I support people who are going through this? So we know it's a big problem, and we know smart home technology is a hugely growing market. It's growing really fast. So this is a really important thing that the people who make those products need to start thinking about. So when we're talking about designing against this type of device abuse, a couple things to keep in mind. Who gets to control what? If there's a home with multiple adults in it, there should be some mechanisms that try to get those adults equal power. Even if they're imperfect and they're not going to work all the time, it would be helpful. This is kind of similar to the joint bank account issue. We shouldn't actually just be designing things for one person who gets all the power and then anyone else kind of gets secondary privileges when we know that the people using this are often couples and families. Users should also always be able to consent to things. People should be able to consent to things in general from their devices, but this is really important when it comes to something like a communication or a drop-in feature that can be used as a de facto listening device. And also, this one is really boring, but I think it's really important. UIs should be able to show you the history of what has happened. So right now, Nest doesn't have any type of log or history of what's happening, but it could look something like this. Just this person turned up the heat at this date and time. I'm positive that Nest is collecting this information for themselves, but they don't reveal it to the user, and they should, because it would help people like in the story Lisa know that she's not crazy, she's not accidentally doing this herself or unable to figure this out. He's actually doing it, and this could also be a useful paper trail for later legal proceedings that, yes, this type of abuse was actually happening, here's the proof. All right, third story. The bad news is that the talk has actually been pretty light and fun so far. It's about to get a lot worse, just so everyone knows. So Sandra and her husband Jake have been together for a while, and he's been physically abusive for a long time. But now she's pregnant, and she's sure that it's going to stop, because who would hurt a pregnant woman? But unfortunately, that's not actually what happens. What happens that's more common is that abuse actually gets worse when a woman is pregnant. And this is because for abusers, everything is about power and control. And when you're pregnant, you're losing a lot of control over your body, how you're spending your time. Maybe people in your life are being more involved. And for an abuser, that's really hard. They're losing control over their partner. They're also irrationally usually pretty jealous of the attention that a fetus is getting, which doesn't make a lot of sense to people who have never been through this or aren't abusers themselves, but they're very irrational with their expectations of their partner. So 11% is the percentage of women in Canada who self-report physical violence at the hands of a partner. So this is really high. This is a little more than 1 in 10. And I want to draw attention to this self-report part of it, because we know that self-reporting statistics are always a lot lower than what is actually happening. And I don't have a slide for this, but in America, the #1 cause of death among pregnant women is not anything related to the actual pregnancy medically. It's murder at the hands of an intimate partner, which is a really awful, really shocking statistic. And it hopefully drives home why we should take this seriously. So in terms of designing for helping pregnant women, it's less about preventing some type of abuse and more about recognizing that this is a really big space where we could have some intervention. I think there's so many pregnancy apps out there, but also just general health apps or sort of mental wellness apps could and should plan for this reality of domestic violence in women's lives and have an injury. So in Sandra's case, she, after an assault by her husband, was trying to figure out what the impact of this trauma was on her growing fetus. So she had all these different apps. There's so many of them out there. She has a general health one that just lets her put in, how much I ran, what did I eat, things like that. And then she has one specifically for pregnancy where she can put in how much tuna is acceptable to eat versus salmon, and what's the impact on a fetus of 1 cup of coffee versus 5. And it gets really detailed with all these things, which is great. But none of these apps for her had any way that she could put in an injury to her abdominal area and understand the impact of that on a growing baby. And it should. So that's the recommendation for any type of health-related product. We know that 1 in 5, right, women, 1 in 6 men experience domestic violence, so this should be planned for in our health-related products, and definitely pregnancy-related products. And it could be something really simple where you put in, add an injury. It doesn't have to be really, you might get injured for a lot of different reasons that you might want to record in your health apps. You could put in, you have this injury, and then put in some details about it. Word recognition could be used to recognize any words that make it seem like maybe this is related to domestic violence, and then it could just pop up a window saying, this seems like it's related to domestic violence. You don't deserve this, and it isn't normal. Can we offer you some resources? And then it could kind of connect them with the appropriate local resources. All right, so this next story is about Erica. She's been with her boyfriend Rob for about 6 months, and he's really controlling, kind of awful. So she breaks up with him. But suddenly he is everywhere she's going. She's being stalked, and she can't figure out how he's doing it. She's already disabled all of her social media. She's read about all these really intricate things that could potentially be letting someone know about her location, such as maybe he synced his device with one of hers, while she was at his house one night and not paying attention. So she's gone through all these different things, and he's still finding her. And then finally, she's talking to her friends. It's I need to figure this out. How is he doing it? And one of her friends, who's really into cars, says, have you checked out your car's GPS system? Sure enough, she has just purchased a new Ford, and all new Fords have really great consoles in the middle with a GPS, but that location can be seen by other users. Usually it's someone else who purchased the car with you, but it could just be someone who's tech savvy and had 5 minutes alone in your car to set this up. 1 in 10 women in Canada are stalked at some point in their lives. So this is a really big number, and we need to be thinking about designing against stalking, not just for domestic violence victims. It is a very common element of domestic violence, but this happens just a lot in general. So when we're thinking about this, GPS in all settings, like computer and phones are obvious, but other places like a smartwatch, a car console, these all need to be running in the foreground and not the background. So this could look something as simple as this. Geolocation is on. Your location might be visible to other people. This would be slightly annoying for people who aren't going through this, but it would increase safety for a lot of other people. And we've already seen that most car consoles, most people who have a more new car have something where, there's a thing when you first turn on the car that says I'm not going to text, or I'm going to pay attention, or whatever, and it's annoying, and you say yes, okay, and then you move on, you dismiss it. So we've kind of already recognized that there's a bit of a trade-off here when it comes to not annoying the user and keeping them safe, and I think this is another one that should be considered. Users should also be notified anytime that they're location sharing. So there's other services, like Google Maps has one, like you can share your location with someone. This is really useful. You're trying to find them at the beach or whatever. You can go and find them. And some services will tell you like an hour later, 5 hours later, whatever, hey, you're still sharing your location with this person. Do you want to keep doing that? But not all of them do. And this is really important to get consent from the user in the first place, but then consistently get their consent again. Because maybe someone that you used to trust to know your location, you don't trust them anymore, and you want to, but you've forgotten that you ever did that. So it should be an ongoing part of the process. And then, yes. Okay, fifth story. This isn't actually a real story. I thought it would be useful to share a story of the first time that I recognized that I was designing something that could maybe be done with a little more safety in mind. So this was a client who was working on an app that would let people who live in like high-rise buildings or big apartment buildings communicate with the managers of those buildings. So like, hey, I have a leaky sink. Can you please come and fix it? Managing their guest list and things like that. So I was designing the guest list feature, and I was thinking about my past as I've done domestic violence education and training in the past, and I've also worked as or volunteered as a rape crisis counselor, and I learned a lot about lots of different things. So one of the things I learned about was how abusers are typically extremely charming. They're really good at talking their way past someone like a security person at a security desk. So I was thinking about that, and I was also thinking about the fact that the time that a woman leaves is the most dangerous time for her after she leaves a domestic abuse situation, because the abuser has lost all of that control. So this is actually when she's most likely to get murdered. So I was thinking about these things and thinking that just this abuser not being on the guest list wouldn't really be enough, because they're really good at talking their way past or finding a way past. So I had this idea of well, let's make an anti-guest. Not only is this person not on the guest list, but the security person can be warned that they're going to have a really good story about why they should get let in. They're going to be very charming. And then not only should you not let them in, but you should alert the resident that they were trying to see, and probably law enforcement as well, depending on what the resident wanted. So this is a very kind of ultimately simple thing. I didn't get to see if the client actually went with it or not, but it was my suggestion. And I kind of feel like I did my due diligence. I tried. I really hope that they ended up doing this. 75% is the percentage of women who go to shelters in Canada and report that they are in extreme danger. So this is 3 out of 4 women fleeing these situations are in really, really dangerous situations. And then on any given night, there's 3,000 women in Canada who are seeking emergency shelter. So we know that this is a lot of women, and 75% of these women are in a really dangerous situation that they're fleeing from, so we need to do everything we can to make them safe, such as with the anti-guest concepts. So in Canada, it's a woman every 6 days, or 1 to 2 a week, is murdered by her partner. In America, probably due to the easy ability to get guns, it's 3 a day. Yeah, so this is, once again, not an edge case, and it's something that we need to really think about when we're designing for security. And I think that really I just have one recommendation for security, and that is to include survivors in your research and get their stories, because every product is really different. It's not realistic for everyone to become really immersed in this topic the way I have. That's not a realistic solution for people who make technology. But making sure that the research team or design team or whoever is doing research when they're building the product is learning about how domestic violence survivors that have been part of this is. And that's actually the first step in the framework for designing for safety that I created. So we're going to jump right into that, is to include those stories. Remember, so this is in the US, it's 1 in 3 women, 1 in 4 men. Here in Canada, it's 1 in 5 women, 1 in 6 men will experience physical abuse. So it's not an edge case. And if your user base includes men or women, basically, you should be doing this research. The second is to imagine the scenarios for abuse and design against them. And that's basically the final story that I shared. That's what I did. I imagined that this could happen, so I made a solution that would, somewhat imperfectly, but at least do a lot to prevent it. Now, To actually do this, I think that you should basically take one day and do these 3 different brainstorms. The first one is a Black Mirror brainstorm, and this was created by someone named Aaron Lewis, and you basically just think, what's the worst case scenario that could happen, like the darkest, most awful thing, like the show Black Mirror, and then identify those things and then kind of include those. The second one is from Sarah Wachter-Becher and Eric Meyer, who developed the concept of stress testing, which is basically walking through your product through the eyes of someone who has had the worst day of their lives, like they just lost a good friend or got fired from their job. And then the third one is for domestic violence, and it's basically the same as stress testing, except going through the eyes of someone who is in a really dangerous situation due to domestic violence. And then once you've identified those things, just work them into your process the way that you would work to find designs for any other issue that you've come across in your research. And then the third and final thing is to identify times when you can offer a safe and meaningful intervention. So just a reminder, these are the 5 areas that I covered, and then there was financial abuse and fitness and health are the most important ones in terms of not necessarily preventing abuse, but just providing intervention. So thinking about, is there a place where a certain type of behavior might indicate abuse, and then how can you connect them with the resources at that moment in time? I think I'm short on time, but I'll just really quickly go through these couple things. These are common excuses people give when they're like, oh, it's just an edge case, we don't need to worry about this. So I wanted to quickly go through these. Is this really our responsibility? Yes. There are no laws really around this stuff yet. This is purely pretty much on us to be doing this. And if you're saying that you'd rather wait for your product to enable stalking or monitoring or getting murdered and then fix the problem, that's pretty unethical. It's lazy and it's selfish. This is our responsibility. Won't this stifle our creativity? This is a big one. Sarah Wachter-Becher has a really good response for this, and that's to point to people who make cars. We haven't ever thought that, forcing people to wear seatbelts, but that's stifling the creativity of the car designers. Like, no one thinks like that. So we shouldn't be thinking like that either. But this is just an MVP. It's minimum viable product. We just need to get this out to market, get the feedback, see if it's even worth it, and then we'll invest time in these things that you're talking about. This is kind of the same as the first one, but the MVP could be used for any of these things, so we have a responsibility to work against all of these things before we release the MVP. And then the last one is, but we should really be focusing on something else instead. We should be focusing more on supporting survivors, or just, working with kids to prevent this from happening in the first place. And that's all true. But there's a lot of things that need to happen, and it's not an if or say, like, we can do all of the things, but when we're at work from 9 to 5, we're the actual people making this technology. This is our work that we do from 9 to 5 every day. And we can start doing it right now. So I hope that you will start doing that. Thank you for listening. My name is Eva. I don't think I have time for questions, but I want to just quickly share that these stories, people don't always put these stories online. It's really personal, so I rely a lot on people sharing with me. I keep everything anonymous, obviously, like you saw, change names. Please get in touch if you would like to share something that happened to you or someone else, or just have different ideas. This is still very new. I don't have this online anywhere yet, but I'm working on it. If you want to support me, I'm on Patreon, and you can hire Athlight to make your software. And find me at lunch or just during the conference, and I'm happy to talk. Thanks.